The summer of 1922 was dry in New Mexico, until it wasn't. The storms that had been building over the Jemez and Sacramento ranges since mid-July finally broke on the 14th of August, dropping 3 inches of rain in less than 2 hours across a drainage system that had not seen significant water in 11 months. What followed was a wall of red-brown water moving through the canyon country at the speed of a fast horse, carrying sandstone boulders and uprooted juniper and the topsoil of 100 square miles compressed into a single violent passage. The canyon that ran southeast from the base of the Nacimiento Mountains into the upper Rio Puerco drainage was called by the ranchers who grazed cattle near its rim Arroyo Seco del Norte, a name that had always been accurate. By the 14th of August, it was no longer accurate. The water came through in less than 40 minutes and left a canyon floor buried under 4 feet of deposited material and a west wall that had not looked like that the day before. Elias Cordova found it on the morning of August 16th. He had been riding the eastern fence line of his family's cattle range, a strip of high desert grazing land his grandfather had settled in 1878, when he came down into the arroyo to assess whether the flood had taken out the rock crossing his grandfather had built across the lower channel. The crossing was buried under 3 feet of new sediment. The west wall of the canyon was something else entirely. The flood had stripped approximately 30 feet of accumulated surface material from the base of the west wall, exposing rock that the overburden had concealed since before any member of his family had run cattle in that country. What Cordova saw in the exposed face was a threshold, a rectangular opening approximately 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, cut into the sandstone with right angles that the desert does not produce and has never produced through wind or water. The edges were dressed, the jambs were vertical. The lintel was a single horizontal piece of the same sandstone, fitted into the surrounding rock with a precision that Cordova, whose father had spent 30 years working stone in the old way, recognized immediately as the product of deliberate hands working with deliberate purpose. He dismounted, tied his horse to an exposed root above the cut bank, and went in. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The interior was dry. That was the first thing Cordova noted, and he noted it carefully because the flood had occurred 2 days before, and the surrounding canyon walls still carried the faint dampness of recent water at depth. The chamber inside the threshold was dry, in a way that suggested its air had not mixed with outside air in a long time. The second thing he noticed was the scale. The room ran approximately 25 feet back from the threshold and widened to perhaps 18 feet across, the ceiling rising to a barrel arch at its center, the crown approximately 10 feet above a floor that was level and flat. The walls had been smoothed, not by water but by hand, the sandstone worked to a finish that still showed tool marks after however long it had been sealed. Along both walls, beginning about 3 feet in from the threshold and continuing to the back wall, ran a continuous shelf carved directly from the living rock, not mortared or attached but integral to the wall itself, cut as one piece from the same formation. The shelf was empty. The dust settled across its surface was undisturbed and had the particular quality of sediment that has not been touched in a very long time, but the shelf had held objects. Along the floor below it, Cordova could see where fine-grained dust had compressed around the bases of things that had stood in one position for long enough to leave their shapes pressed into the accumulated sediment beneath them. Circular impressions, ranging from roughly 8 to 14 inches across at their bases, spaced at intervals along the shelf's length. Whatever had stood there was gone. What remained was the record of where it had stood. He spent the better part of 20 minutes inside. He was not a man with scientific training, but he had grown up in the canyon country, had helped his father dress and fit stone in structures that were meant to last, and he had spent 30 years reading terrain for what it said about water and time. The chamber was not a natural cavity. The arch of the ceiling had been shaped, not formed. The shelf was carved with a consistent hand across the full perimeter of 3 walls. And whatever had stood on that shelf, for however many years it had stood there, had been removed by people who understood what they were taking and where they intended to take it. He came back out through the threshold into the August light, stood at the dressed jambs for a long time looking at the lintel stone and the precision of its fitting, then mounted and rode south to Lahara, 12 miles away, where there was a telephone at the general store. The man at the county office in Cuba told him to put it in writing. Cordova did not put it in writing. He rode instead to the office of Preston Whitfield, a land agent who operated out of Bernalillo and who had been in a boundary dispute with the Cordova family for several years over the eastern edge of their range. Whatever their differences, Whitfield was a man who responded quickly to evidence and who had connections in Santa Fe that Cordova did not. By evening, Cordova had reached him. Whitfield drove out to the arroyo the following morning and confirmed every detail. That afternoon he sent a telegram to the State Land Office in Santa Fe. The reply arrived in 36 hours. It did not come from the State Land Office. It came from the Bureau of American Ethnology, a federal institution operating under the Smithsonian, with instructions directing Whitfield to secure the site, admit no additional visitors, and await the arrival of a survey team that would reach Bernalillo within the week. Neither Whitfield nor Cordova had contacted the Bureau. Neither man had communicated with any federal agency. The telegram Whitfield sent had gone to a state office. The response had come from Washington and named a team already being assembled for deployment. Whatever path the information had taken between a state land office in Santa Fe and the Bureau's operations desk, it had traveled in under 36 hours and arrived as a directive rather than an inquiry. Whitfield had not asked the Bureau to come. Someone else had. The Bureau of American Ethnology had been conducting systematic archaeological and documentary survey work across the Southwest since the early 1880s, with sustained attention to the canyon country of the Colorado Plateau and the Rio Grande drainage. By 1922, its researchers had logged hundreds of ancestral Puebloan sites, mapped road systems, and catalogued material evidence of a pre-Columbian built environment that the standard American historical account had been slow to absorb. The Bureau had been founded under the Smithsonian in 1879 with a mandate to document indigenous languages, oral traditions, and material culture before the communities that held them were further eroded by settlement pressure and federal policy. Over 4 decades of fieldwork in the canyon country, its researchers had developed an intimate familiarity with the specific textures of constructed versus natural stone, with the geometry of dressed masonry, with the difference between what a hand makes in rock and what water or weather makes in the same material. The Bureau's southwestern work had been shaped significantly by the surveys of Frank Hamilton Cushing and Jesse Walter Fewkes in the late 19th century, both of whom had documented constructed chambers, sealed kivas, and stone-lined storage rooms across the Pueblo country with a degree of physical description that distinguished trained observation from casual report. By 1922, the institution had a detailed working vocabulary for what a carved room inside sandstone looked like, what distinguished a natural void from a constructed one, and what a dressed jamb and a fitted lintel meant in terms of the effort and intention behind them. They were not easily confused by what they were looking at in the field. When 4 of them arrived at the arroyo on the 24th of August, 10 days after the flood, they came with lanterns, measuring instruments, notebooks, and a truck carrying materials whose purpose Cordova would not understand until the work was finished. The canyon country of the Nacimiento Range sits at the western margin of what geologists call the Jemez Lineament, a zone of volcanic and tectonic activity running northeast across the region that has shaped the local sandstone formations through uplift, erosion, and the long-cycle deposition of marine and desert sediments laid down across several 100 million years. The Entrada Sandstone, a Jurassic Age formation common to the canyon walls of the Colorado Plateau and its southern extensions, was deposited in an ancient desert dune environment roughly 160 million years ago, when the region that is now New Mexico lay at the edge of a shallow inland sea. It is a dense, fine-grained rock that erodes slowly, fractures with relatively clean faces, and takes a carved surface well when worked with the right tools. The Bureau's fieldmen would have recognized the formation immediately when they entered the chamber. They would have understood what it meant for the rock surrounding the carved walls to be Jurassic in age. Whether they wrote down what that understanding implied is not recorded in the 4 pages they submitted to Washington. The canyon country of northern New Mexico had been a zone of sustained human occupation for thousands of years before any federal survey team set foot in it. The ancestral Puebloan people had built, abandoned, and rebuilt across the region in cycles that the archaeological record traces back at least 12 centuries, and their road systems and architectural complexes at Chaco Canyon, roughly 50 miles northwest of the Nacimiento Mountains, suggest a level of organizational capacity and long-distance coordination that the standard pre-Columbian account has consistently underestimated. The Chaco road system, documented by aerial survey in the 1970s, had extended its reach across the San Juan Basin in ways that the earlier Bureau surveys had not fully mapped, and the Nacimiento Range sat at the southwestern edge of a zone of influence that the Chacoan period's construction tradition had clearly reached. The Bureau's own catalogue of documented sites in the Nacimiento region as of 1922 was thin. The arroyo drainage southeast of the range appears in the Bureau's pre-1922 records only as blank terrain, without a documented site, without a recorded survey, without any notation that the drainage had been formally examined. That the Bureau responded to a telegram about a constructed chamber in this drainage within 36 hours with a fully equipped team suggests the drainage may not have been as blank in the Bureau's institutional knowledge as its published catalogue implied. Cordova's account of the Bureau visit is preserved in a letter he wrote to his brother Augustine in Albuquerque, dated August 30th, 1922. The letter entered the Cordova family papers and was deposited with the University of New Mexico's Center for Southwest Research in 1988. It describes the 4 Bureau men arriving in a truck, entering the chamber 2 at a time, remaining inside for approximately 3 hours across 2 sessions, and asking Cordova, when they emerged, how many people had entered the room before their arrival, and whether anything had been removed from the shelf. He told them, himself and Whitfield, separately, on different days. He told them the shelf had been empty when he entered. The eldest of the 4 wrote both answers in a notebook without comment. Then all 4 men went back through the threshold together and stayed for another 2 hours. When they came out the second time, they spoke only to each other, in voices Cordova could not hear from the cut bank above. The partial field report that entered the institutional archive consists of 4 handwritten pages. It was submitted to the Bureau's Washington office in September of 1922 under the heading Survey Note, Bernalillo County, Arroyo Drainage, Miscellaneous. The report documents the chamber's dimensions, the carved shelf, and the impressions in the floor sediment. It identifies the host rock as Entrada Sandstone, a Jurassic Age formation deposited approximately 160 million years ago. The report does not address what this identification implies about when the chamber could have been constructed. It does not estimate the age of the carving. It notes that the site shows evidence of prior evacuation of material goods, the Bureau's phrase for a space that had held objects which were no longer present. It closes with the notation, "Further survey not warranted. Classification, local geological anomaly." The classification requires an institution to choose between 2 things, the anomaly that fits the record and the anomaly that does not. 4 pages for a room inside Jurassic sandstone. 1 line of classification, no recommendation to return. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. A researcher named Diane Castellano located the report in 2009 while reviewing unprocessed survey materials in the National Anthropological Archives at the Smithsonian Institution. She had been working through a backlog of Bernalillo County field notes from the 1920s, most of them routine boundary surveys and irrigation records, when she came across the 4 pages filed under the miscellaneous heading. The report was unfiled alphabetically and sat between a land boundary notation for Rio Arriba County and an unrelated record of a pottery sample from a site near Albuquerque. Its placement in the archive suggested it had been handled quickly and shelved without the indexing that other survey notes from the same period received. She published a short article about the find in the New Mexico Historical Review in 2011, noting the classification's inadequacy relative to what the report described, the absence of any follow-up record in the Bureau's files, and the anomalous pace of the Bureau's original deployment, given the communication sequence Whitfield's journal entry implied. The catalogue number is listed in the archive's finding aid. The 4 pages have not been digitized. No response to her article appeared in the journal from any Bureau successor agency or from any Smithsonian department in the years after publication. By the end of August 1922, the threshold was sealed. The Bureau men had brought bags of concrete mix on the truck that Whitfield allowed across the lower section of his range. The opening was filled from the ground up, the lintel buried beneath poured concrete, the dressed jambs covered. When the work was finished, the west wall showed a patched section of sandstone that only a person who had seen the original threshold would recognize as anything other than routine repair of flood damage. Cordova watched the filling from the rim above the cut bank without speaking to the Bureau men again. He rode home before they broke down the truck and left the arroyo behind. He did not speak to Whitfield about it again for 11 years. When they met at a land hearing in Cuba in 1933, Cordova asked whether the Bureau had been in contact since the summer of 22. Whitfield said they had not. He said a man from the Bureau had telephoned in September of that year and told him the site had been assessed and classified, and that any public discussion of the chamber would interfere with an ongoing survey operation in the county. Whitfield took this to mean he was not to discuss it publicly. He did not discuss it publicly for the rest of his life. He died in Bernalillo in 1957. His son found a journal his father had kept and donated it to the Bernalillo County Historical Society in 1961. The entry for August 18, 1922 reads, Cordova's Arroyo, west wall, room inside the stone, dressed walls, carved shelf, empty. Bureau men came. They knew before we told them. That final sentence is what the institutional record cannot account for. Whitfield's telegram went to the State Land Office in Santa Fe on August 17th. The Bureau's response arrived on August 18th, with a federal team already being organized for deployment. A federal scientific institution based in Washington issued deployment orders within 36 hours of a communication sent not to that institution, but to a state land office, regarding a site it had no prior survey record of, in a county at the outer edge of its current documented fieldwork. The Bureau's internal files for August of 1922 contain no memorandum authorizing the deployment, no internal communication referencing the Bernalillo County Arroyo, and no record of the field team's composition. Whatever produced the rapid response is not in the paper trail the institution left. Something moved faster than the paper. The chamber's geology does not resolve the difficulty. The Entrada sandstone at the depth where the threshold was exposed accumulates overburden at a rate that places the burial of the entrance at a minimum of several centuries before the flood removed it, possibly considerably longer. The chamber had been sealed before those sediment layers were deposited, which means the closing of the room predates the Spanish colonial period in New Mexico and places the sealing at a time before any European documentation of the region began. The carving itself, in host rock deposited 160 million years ago, raises questions the 4-page field report declines to frame. Entrada sandstone is dense, uniform in grain, and requires sustained effort to carve even with metal tools. The dressed finish on the walls and the precision of the fitted lintel represent a level of working that goes beyond rough excavation. Someone had cut a room, shaped its surfaces to a specified finish, installed a shelf across 3 walls, and then managed the removal of all the carved-out material before sealing the entrance and allowing the canyon wall to bury the threshold under the slow accumulation of centuries. That material was not inside the chamber when Cordova entered it, and was not found in the vicinity of the exposed threshold. It had been removed from the site entirely. The room was built, The debris was cleared, and the entrance was sealed, and all of this occurred before the canyon wall above the threshold accumulated the layers of deposited material that the flood stripped away in less than 40 minutes on the 14th of August. The shelf impressions are what the record holds most precisely, because the field report describes them in enough detail to allow reconstruction. Circular outlines, between 8 and 14 inches in diameter at their bases, preserved in consolidated fine-grained dust along the floor below the shelf. The depth of consolidation around the impressions implies the objects occupied their positions for a period long enough for the still air sediment of the sealed chamber to compress around their bases and hold their shape after the objects were lifted away. Castellano, in her 2011 article, described the stratigraphic implication as consistent with the objects having stood in their positions for a minimum of several decades before removal, and quite possibly much longer. The objects were not recently removed. They were taken long before the flood opened the wall, by people who had accessed the chamber through a threshold that was afterward resealed so thoroughly that 11 months of dry weather and 40 years of human occupation of the surrounding range had produced no surface trace of what was behind the canyon face. The Pueblo peoples of the Rio Grande Valley hold records of the land that the formal archaeological survey has not fully absorbed into its published account. A scholar of Yemez heritage named Marcus Yepper published a short piece in 1994 in a regional anthropological journal, noting that the oral tradition of the Yemez people includes references to sealed chambers in the canyon country west of the Yemez Mountains that were not built by the Puebloan ancestors but were known to them and recognized as old in a way that distinguished them from ancestral Puebloan construction. The tradition, as Yepper described it, holds that the chambers were found already sealed when the ancestors first moved through the canyon country, that whatever they had contained was already gone, and that the appropriate response was to leave them as the land had left them. The tradition does not name a builder. It does not account for where the contents went. It holds the places as belonging to an account of the land that precedes the Puebloan period entirely. Yepper noted that the tradition was specific about one further detail. The chambers that the ancestors encountered had shelves. Not floors, not alcoves, but continuous carved shelves running along the walls, described in the oral account in terms that Yepper found consistent with carved rock construction rather than the timber or adobe shelving common in Puebloan domestic contexts. Yepper's piece appeared in a journal with limited distribution and was not cited in the major southwestern archaeological literature. The Bureau of Land Management's current archaeological inventory for the drainage southeast of the Nacimiento Mountains does not list a constructed chamber site among its documented resources. The Arroyo Seco del Norte appears on current topographic maps as a dry drainage running southeast from the Nacimientos into the upper Rio Puerco country. The ranching families who have worked the land around it since the late 19th century know it as terrain, as a feature that floods badly in heavy rain years and runs dry otherwise. The west wall of the canyon, in the section the flood of 1922 exposed, shows a stretch of weathered material that local ranchers in accounts Castellano collected during a site visit in 2010 described as old repair work whose origin no one could explain. The concrete has accumulated decades of additional weathering. The surrounding sandstone has continued to deposit surface material in the years since the threshold was filled. The patched section of wall is now nearly indistinguishable from the natural face. Behind it, sealed since August of 1922, the shelf runs along two walls of a dry chamber inside Jurassic sandstone. The impressions in the floor sediment are still there, the compressed outlines of things that stood in one place for long enough to leave a record of their shape in the settled dust below them. The Bureau men's boot prints are there. Cordova's boot prints are there. The arch of the ceiling is intact above a floor that has not breathed outside air since the concrete was mixed and poured against the dressed jambs by men who came in a truck with materials they had prepared before they had formally assessed what they were sealing. Elias Cordova's letter to his brother Augustine runs 12 pages. Most of it concerns ranch business and a fence dispute, that had been dragging through the county for 3 years. The 6 paragraphs about the chamber sit in the middle without ceremony, placed between a report on the condition of a water tank and a request for his brother to come out for the feast day at Zia in September. Cordova did not write about the chamber as though it had frightened him. He wrote about it as a man who had found something he could not fit into any category available to him, and who was describing it as carefully as he could so that someone else would understand what he had seen. He described the dressed walls with the language of a man who knew masonry. He described the empty shelf with the language of a man who knew the difference between a surface that had always been empty and a surface that had been cleared. He described the impressions in the floor dust as one would describe animal tracks, shapes left by the weight of things that were no longer there, each one telling him something about the size and placement of what had stood above it. The Bureau classified the chamber as a local geological anomaly and recommended no further survey. The flood found it in August of 1922, and the Bureau sealed it in the same month. And behind the concrete poured against the fitted lintel and the dressed jambs of a threshold cut into rock that was laid down 160 million years ago, the shelf holds nothing now except the impressions of what it once held, the pressed record of objects that stood in one place through however many sealed years before. Hands that knew what they were handling carried them away without leaving a record the institution chose to preserve. The arroyo runs dry for 11 months of the year. The west wall holds what it was given to hold. Every flash flood that has moved through that country since 1922 has passed within 100 feet of the sealed threshold without opening it a second time. The room does not require the floods to find it. It has been inside the sandstone since before the stone was stone, and the impressions on the floor are still the shape of what stood there, waiting in the dark for whoever comes next to understand what the Bureau chose not to say. Whitfield's journal said they knew before we told them. Castellano's article said no follow-up was ever filed. The Jemez oral tradition said the shelves were already there when the ancestors arrived. The 4-page report said local geological anomaly and went into a catalogue number that has not been opened since 2009. The concrete is over 100 years old now. The canyon wall above it is still Jurassic sandstone, still accumulating new surface, still holding the threshold behind it, in the particular patience of rock that measures time in ways no institution has yet chosen to examine. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.